And this is the fourth installment of In Perspective, Small Bites of the Big Apple, a ongoing series. We do this once a quarter, approximately, of talks that look at prints, primarily prints, that are on view at Arader Galleries on the Upper East Side. So, what's great about this talk is that if you are in New York, or planning to travel to New York, you can, if you are enamored of any of these, go in and see them in person. Pick one up, take it home. If you don't know me, welcome. My wife Michelle and I are the author of books like Inside the Apple, A Streetwise History of New York City. I was reading it, and yet I still couldn't come up with the title. And Footprints in New York, tracing the lives of 4 centuries of New Yorkers, and some guidebooks. And I'm a journalist, and I am not an art historian. I like to say that right off the bat. But being a New York City historian requires a certain amount of architectural and art history background because the city is so architectural and artistic. And so, what I wanted to talk about tonight was a kind of classic genre of New York City print, which is views of the harbor. This is actually not a print we're talking about tonight, but this is this view that you see all the time in New York City, which is this kind of bird's eye view showing New York Harbor in the foreground, and you can see all the boats, and you can see all of, let me get my laser pointer out here, you can see all of the traffic up and down, all of these boats docked on both sides, the East River, the Hudson River. As far as the eye can see, it's nothing but sailing vessels. So this is a very typical view of New York Harbor. Me being me, I wanted to concentrate on atypical views of New York Harbor. So we're going to look very briefly at 4 images of New York Harbor, one from the 18th century, 2 from the middle of the 19th century, and 1 from just a little bit later in the 19th century. And we're going to start with the one that was that slide that you were holding on, which is known as the Carwithem view of Fort George. So the print is titled A View of Fort George with the City of New York from the Southwest. And it was almost certainly drawn somewhere in either 1731 or 1732. And we know that from the context of the buildings in New York City. Trinity Church, which we will talk about in a second, which is over here, voted to expand its campus in the late 1720s. And so the fact that we see construction here places this, or see the new construction, and we're not actually seeing it under construction, but the fact that we see the expanded Trinity Church places it in the early 1730s. Meanwhile, the old church in the fort burns down later in the 1730s. So we only have a kind of narrow period. If, and this is the big if, this is a genuine view of the city. I happen to believe that it is, but I say this all the time when I'm talking about prints, drawings, paintings, photographs, you name it. They lie. And people put in things that they want you to see, and sometimes things that are not there. So what you're looking at in the, we're going to talk about the vessels. This is mostly a talk about the water. But what you are looking at in the center of this print is Fort George. It had been built as Fort Amsterdam when New York was New Amsterdam. And in 1664, when the English took over, it got its name changed. And essentially from that point forward, it was named after the reigning monarch. It would have had the English standard flying over it until 1702, and then what you're seeing here after the Act of Union is what is known as the Union Standard, and you see it in 3 different examples on this. This is the Union Standard flying over the fort. This is the naval version of the Union Standard flying on the back, the stern, as we call it, of this naval vessel, and up here at the very top is what's called a pennant. We think of them in terms of baseball, which flies from the topmost mast of a sailing vessel. It is also, if you can look up close at it, the Union standard as well, trailing into dual colors. Uh, this is what I mean about prints and paintings not always being necessarily accurate. An extremely long pennant like that is what's called a paying off pennant. Won't get into the details of this, but it has to do with a ship coming back to its home port at the end of its commission. Is that really what's being depicted in this? We don't know what ship this is. Or is this some artistic license? What we do know is that in this 1731 print, sorry, I got to get off that screen, is based on an earlier painting by a man named William Burgess. And you can see when you look at these two side by side that the Burgess ship and the Carr Witham ship are exactly the same. I mean, this is the same picture. There's the flag, there's the fort in the background. The Burgess view is often dated also to 1731, 1732, but it may be as early as 1717. That's neither here nor there. What we're looking at, it is probably 20 guns or fewer, which is typical of colonial vessels of this era. Now, this is a particularly nice version of this print. There are good versions and there are less good versions. One of the things I like about this is that it is accurate. Some of these are printed after 1783, which means after the American Revolution, and they actually keep everything the same, and they take this and make it an American flag because it was being printed after we were no longer a English colony. But one of the things I like about this is that it is free of the numbering system that you often see on this print. Here is a version from the Library of Congress, and if we zoom in on it, you can see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8, that there is a key that actually lets you know what you're looking at. And these buildings are in order: Trinity Church, the Lutheran Church, the New Dutch Church, the French Church, City Hall, the Old Dutch Church, the Secretary's office, which I think we're seeing that is just inside the fort, and the church in the fort, which was also a Dutch church. So let's put these underneath our nice version of the print. So obviously the spires in a town are generally churches. But what is interesting to me is this is 70 years after the English takeover. And we have Trinity Church, which sort of has pride of place in this print over on this side. But this is a Dutch church, and this is a Dutch church, and this is a Dutch church. So that is very telling about how Dutch New York had stayed 7 decades after the English takeover, that these were still all active churches, which just an interesting point to share. So we move forward in time. We're now looking at what is called the Paperill Catherwood view of the harbor, as viewed from Governor's Island in about 1846. 1846 is the date generally ascribed to this. Again, when prints are taken from sketches that were made earlier, we may be looking at a slightly earlier. And Frederick Catherwood is the person who did the original painting. He is not super well known for his New York views. What he is known for is traveling first in the 1830s to the Holy Land, and you can see the sketch of the Dome of the Rock here, and then going to Mexico and South America in the 1840s. And he was one of the very first Westerners to view some of these ruined temples and record them, and it kind of opens up archaeological interest in the Yucatan and in South America. But in somewhere circa 1846, he's hanging out on Governor's Island, and so you can see in the foreground here, this is the cannons and the soldiers. This is what we today call Fort J, and which they called Fort Columbus. Here's Fort J as it looks today. And John Jay was the first Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. He was a Federalist. He was the person who negotiated the Jay Treaty in 1794 with the British, which kind of ironed out some of the things that had not been ironed out at the end of the American Revolution. He was highly unpopular. The Federalists were highly unpopular, and when they were swept out of power after John Adams was president, sometime around then, this was changed from Fort J to Fort Columbus, presumably named after Christopher Columbus, mostly just as a way of not honoring John Jay. Sometime in the 20th century, I've read a variety of different dates, it reverted to Fort J, though you can still see documentation well into the 1930s, still calling it Fort Columbus. That's neither here nor there. If we zoom into the harbor, we're starting to get a busier harbor. Let's actually zoom out again. We have these ships in the foreground here, but like in that very first print that I showed you, you can see just sort of this forest of masts going up the East River, and we're going to look at that in a second. You can also see, now we'll zoom in. There's Castle Clinton, which was a fort from the War of 1812. There's Trinity Church, so you can see the spire, and more masts going up the docks of the Hudson River. But what we have in the foreground here are a couple of smaller sailing vessels. And then this one, which is quite interesting, which is a pilot boat. And I don't know how well you can see it, but right here is imprinted on the sail number 9. And here's a painting of the number 9 pilot boat. It was a boat called the James Avery. There were only 21 pilot boats based out of Sandy Hook that had pilots that could guide ships into New York Harbor. So what would happen is that these boats would sail up to arriving cargo ships, and if you got there first, I mean, you were competing against the other 20 pilots to be the person who got the gig and would be paid to get on and pilot the boat through the Verrazano Narrows and into New York Harbor and into its berth either on the East River or the Hudson River. So I just think it's great that they are choosing to put a pilot boat here in the foreground. The boats that they would be piloting were clipper ships. Now, over here you see a steamship. And in 1807, Robert Fulton, right here, right off the battery, had perfected steam locomotion for boats in a boat that was called the North River Steamboat, later called the Claremont. And they steamed up to Albany and they steamed back. And that brought about steam locomotion for vessels on rivers. But they couldn't use those boats for long distance cargo. I can't remember which boat this is. The very first steam vessel to cross the Atlantic was a boat called the SS Savannah in about 1819, I want to say. And I just can't get the details of this story in my head. It may have actually used sail power most of the time. The first boat that went across the Atlantic completely under steam was so worried about running out of coal that they took no cargo and they took no passengers because they wanted basically the entire boat to be loaded down with coal. So that's why steamships were not long-distance ocean-going vessels. But what happens in the 1840s when this print is being made is that the clipper ship is in ascendance. And clipper, because they sail, they move along at a very fast clip. And so they are rigged in such a way as to catch the wind, and this really revolutionizes world transport. And so clipper ships, it's a clipper ship that is getting pride of place in this print. Zoom back out again, and you can see it there. Now, as I pointed out, lots of forest of masts, as I always say, going up the East River. So let's look at our next print, which shows us the angle looking from the top of Trinity Church. This is the view of Brooklyn from Trinity Church in 1852. J.W. Hill is the printmaker, Now, it's so foreshortened. If you know where Trinity Church is, it's the corner of Broadway and Wall Street. And even from the top of it, looking towards the East River, you are going to have some foreground, which has been in this print completely cut off. So what this really is a high view of the East River and Brooklyn and the ships, with Wall Street completely removed. But if we zoom in, you can see that this building is the Wall Street Ferry. And so this would have been where a boat, probably very much like this one, would have carried passengers from the foot of Wall Street to Brooklyn Heights, to right there, I think, and back again. Brooklyn in these days was a completely independent city. It remains that until the 1890s. It was fourth largest city in the United States, fast becoming the second largest city in the United States, or third. I guess Chicago was in between. And many people who lived in Brooklyn Heights commuted to banks, insurance firms, etc. on Wall Street. So Brooklyn Heights over here was kind of the first commuter suburb in New York City. And again, this is what Robert Fulton's steam engine was being used for, these short journeys, these river journeys, not for open ocean going vessels. But we do have a good view of some of these ocean going vessels here at port, unloading their cargo. This part of town was incredibly important because, if we could step backwards out of this print just a few feet and turn around, we would be at Tontine's Coffee House, which was the first stock exchange. And then we would be, in this era, at the Merchants Exchange and the banks. So goods coming in and out of this particular part of Lower Manhattan was a way for people to keep their pulse, their finger on the pulse of of what was going on in New York commercially. Just want to zoom in if I can. There we go. Zoom in to show you Brooklyn Heights. If you are at all familiar with this neighborhood, this is where Brooklyn Bridge State Park now stands. And this here and this here, these are staircases. It's where the BQE runs. And so what you used to do was you would get off a boat, a ferry, somewhere around here. I think that's the ferry terminal. And there's a ramp here for taking cargo, but you would climb upstairs. And I actually have a picture of it. There's one of these very steep staircases taking you up. This is a slightly later era, this picture, but taking you up to these grand houses that if you lived here, I can't remember if this is Seth Lowe's house or not, but some of the great merchants in Brooklyn had houses in Brooklyn Heights that looked out, like literally looked out over the East River, so they too could keep their finger on the pulse of what was coming and going. So for our last print, we're just going to jump forward in time to 1872. So this is by Currier and Ives. Extremely well-known printmakers from the end of the 19th century in New York. This is the beginning of the so-called Gilded Age. I normally date that as beginning in 1872. So like if you've watched the HBO series or took any talks that I've given about 1872, this is the beginning of the period of tremendous growth and tremendous wealth in New York City. And just look at that harbor. Just look at how crammed with boats it is, not just here close to Lower Manhattan. There's Castle Clinton and Battery Park, but out through the Narrows and way as far as the eye can see. Now, New York had really gotten this stranglehold on shipping, incoming and outgoing, into the United States after the late October 1825 opening of the Erie Canal, the so-called Wedding of the Waters. DeWitt Clinton, who was the governor of New York, got on a boat, a canal boat, with water from the Great Lakes and brought it down the canal and down the Hudson and then emptied it into New York Harbor. So the Great Lakes and the Atlantic were connected. So that meant goods coming into the United States could make it into the heartland, and that raw materials from the heartland of the United States could make it to New York and then to the rest of the country, to Europe, to the world. So this view, I just, is sort of the opposite. There's Battery Park, Castle Clinton. There's that one I showed you before, Battery Park, Castle Clinton. So this is just the reverse of what we were looking at. And if we zoom in, you can see that the boats here, trying to figure out which I was going to talk about next. Do I have another zoom in here? Yes, there, I can go in even further. So now we're starting to get ocean-going steam vessels. So notice this has 1, 2, 3, 4 giant masts, and coming right out of the center here is a steam funnel. So they've invented the screw propeller. There are steam-going vessels, but well into the Gilded Age, there are no steam vessels that do not have sails, because what happens. You want to take advantage of all of the various modes of power that you can. So, but we're starting to get steam vessels. We're getting ones that are fully. Oh no, that's got masts too. There's a fully steam vessel. You've got smaller boats. You've got larger sailing sloops, and you can see here, you still have clipper ships. It's really, I love this view because you never see this view. And one of the things I love about it is that it has this remarkable key along the bottom telling you everything you're looking at. So this is Battery Park, and we'll just zoom in on one little bit here. It's showing you the Revenue Barge Office, Greenwood Cemetery, Staten Island Ferry, etc., etc. So let's just show those. That's the Revenue Barge Office and the Staten Island Ferry. Do you see this patch of green back here? That's Greenwood Cemetery. That's Red Hook, Brooklyn, and Fort Columbus. Is it calling it still Fort Columbus in this? Yes, Fort Columbus. And then if you go over the Verrazano Narrows, or just most people just call it the Narrows, that's Bedloe's Island, which is now officially Liberty Island. So we are just in 1872, a few years away from the American centennial, and a few years after that, the Statue of Liberty arrives and is put on Bedloe's Island. There's Ellis Island over there. This is, of course, New Jersey back here. So it's just there's so much detail in this print. There's so much remarkable attention to detail in this print that this is probably my favorite, because especially if you were someone who knows the city in this era, I feel like, again, what I really like about it is that it's not showing you what you typically see, that it is so concentrated on, as it's called, the Port of New York. So these are the 4 images. There they all are. I am going to take questions about them. I just want to, in the meantime, let everybody know that there are 2 upcoming talks that registration is open for. Coming on not this coming Monday, but Monday, 19th of September, is the Feast of San Gennaro. And so I'm going to be giving a talk about Italian immigration, and specifically people from Naples who settled on Mulberry Street, and how the Feast of San Gennaro, which started in the Feast of San Gennaro is an ancient feast, but it started to get popular in the 1920s in New York, and then, of course, is still popular to this day. So that's going to be looking at sort of the cultural history of that area. Some overlap with a talk I've already given that mentioned some of the Italians, but a lot of new material as well. And then on October 6th, I'll be talking about the art and architecture of Soho. That's going to be a lot about cast iron architecture, and about how Soho has undergone so many transformations over the years. And So I am happy to open the floor to questions. I'm just looking to see if Michael Foley, who I thank very much for helping me set up these talks, he works at Arader Galleries, but it doesn't look like he is on the call. Someone asked how printmakers get the bird's eye view of the harbor and the city. I know at least in some cases, sketches are made from stationary hot air balloons, that is, say, tethered hot air balloons. People would go up in a balloon. Sometimes they would go, as is the case with uh, this one that I was showing you before. That is from the church steeple of Trinity Church. Other churches were often the highest places in New York City. I know of at least one person who went up and did sketches from the top of the Statue of Liberty once it opened. But also, something to keep in mind is that they are based on being good artists. Some of them are based on people knowing what it looks like at street level, knowing what a map looks like, and then turning it into something that is believable. And it has to be plausible, but it doesn't have to be perfect. So, like, for example, if you look at this, this is, you know, upper Manhattan stretching into infinity up here in this Currier and Ives, and a long, straight Hudson River that isn't necessarily as straight as this. And, the perspective is really forced. So, you start to think on a piece like this, if they were really up in a hot air balloon taking this view, wouldn't they have gotten it a little bit better? Wouldn't it be a little bit more correct? Are there any other questions? Sometimes my laser pointer gets stuck on the screen. Sorry about that. Happy to answer any questions. I am not a maritime historian, but you can, the thing about New York City is you can't understand New York history without understanding a little bit about the fact that it was, well into the 20th century, the biggest port in the United States. And so New York is a history. Where can you find the prints and the names of the artists? I will send them. Everyone's going to get a link tomorrow to this video, whether you watch the whole thing or not. And I will send you the full names of each of the prints. And I would love it. Again, if you're in New York, please stop by Arader Galleries on Madison Avenue. They would love to see you. And you can just focus on how great these pieces are. Someone asks, did the big ships with cargo dock near the land, or did barges unload while the ship was in the harbor? After a certain point in the 17th century, they docked. You can see, this is actually a good print to have up. I mean, these are ships docked in docks that are built on landfill so that they could just completely unload directly. The efficient thing was to unload directly, not to tender in cargo. And the Dutch realized that. And so the Dutch were the first people to build a dock that was deep enough that ships could tie up. What is the triangle in this bird's eye of Manhattan? I mean, this one right here is the question someone asks. That is Broadway and the Bowery coming together at Union Square. And if I had to guess, the reason that this one is so prominent is that you're looking at the elevated railroad in it. So it makes it stand out. What kind of cargo? Oh, and every kind of cargo you can imagine. So for a long time, New York was our number one import was sugar. We had the largest sugar manufacturing certainly in the United States, and that what's left over from that is the Domino Sugar factory in Williamsburg, Brooklyn. But yeah, sugar, the Havemeyers and sugar were what we did. But cloth, timber, lumber, grain, you name it. If we were selling it or we were buying it, and by we I mean the United States, there's a good chance. I mean, there are other ports, obviously. Baltimore was a big port. Galveston, Texas is a port. Things get shipped in and out of New Orleans, but especially before the opening up of the West. Everything's coming in and out of the East Coast. It became so prominent. This is a story that people tell all the time that uh, almost all of the cotton that was grown in the South before the Civil War was milled and turned into cloth in mills in the North. And so cotton uh, was, yeah, someone saying dependence on slavery. Absolutely. Cotton was this huge commodity for the port of New York. So when the Civil War begins, the mayor of New York, a guy named Fernando Wood, puts forward an idea that maybe Manhattan, or New York, yeah, because New York was just Manhattan then, should secede, not to join the Confederacy, but that Manhattan could be an independent city state and therefore could continue to trade with both the Union and the Confederacy because New York was so dependent on shipping things. The sugar is mostly being grown in the Caribbean, so this is absolutely in Puerto Rico, Cuba, Haiti. All of these places have their own terrible histories of servitude that certainly was feeding the New York economy. And so thanks for coming. Thanks again to Arader Galleries for sponsoring this so that we can all just do this for fun. Thanks so much for being here.